As has been made clear throughout this series, logic is the most important toolset for the analysis of reasoning toward our development of knowledge. Fallacies, on the other hand, are faulty applications of this methodology. In the previous tutorial, we gave an overview of what a fallacy is, and what it means in logical terms to commit one, as well as the two general kinds, formal and informal. Hopefully this provided an understanding of the core concept of a fallacy in order to aid you in improving your reasoning skills for identifying and developing quality argumentation. In this tutorial, we'll analyze a few of the most common or characteristic examples of both kinds of fallacies to further cement this understanding through a wider range of applications. This will not in any way be representative of all the types of fallacies already cataloged, which are as many as 200, but it will surely aid in exemplifying the extent to which they can develop. We'll take a look at just a few formal fallacies, since they're mostly technical errors, and then focus on the informal ones, as they're much more common and varied. Among formal fallacies, there are simple ones such as four terms, where instead of our usual three terms in a syllogism, there is an extra one which lacks logical connection with the others. An example would be, every YouTuber is mortal, where there's two terms, Dave is a YouTuber, where we introduce a new one, and thus Sheila is a YouTuber, where a fourth one, Sheila, is introduced, which is not connected with any of the previous premises. Essentially, whenever you want to add an extra term to an argument, you either explain its connections to previous terms or you'll be committing a fallacy. Another example is the epistemic fallacy, or the masked man fallacy, given its first formulation by the Greek Eubulides. An example of this would be, I know who Dave is. I do not know who this masked man is. Thus, this masked man is not Dave. This, of course, is invalid since the lack of knowledge of who lies behind the mask is not correlated in any way to whether it is or is not me, thus its epistemic reference, as the knowledge or belief of an entity is different from that entity itself. Similar, but lesser known, there is also an ontological fallacy, or fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which mistakenly assumes that something does exist without the guarantee that it exists in reality. For example, unicorns are horses with a horn. Horses and horns exist, therefore unicorns exist. This is invalid even though all concepts share some likeness. From the fact that there is something called horse and another thing called horn, it is not true that anything called unicorn will exist. We can also talk about the proof by example fallacy in quantificational logic that happens when a single or merely a few instantiations of something are taken to be representative of that thing instead of an adequate proof of it. An example would be, I know that Dave is a YouTuber, therefore all Daves are YouTubers, which can be represented this way. This is a basic and unwarranted shift from a particular to a universal sentence, which can also be represented this way. There are also slightly different informal versions of this fallacy, such as the faulty generalization fallacy, occurring by a faulty inductive basis of an argument instead of a purely definitional one. An example would be, after arriving in Italy, all 7 Italians I've met were bakers, therefore all Italians are bakers. The limited experiences of a single person, what is called anecdotal evidence, are not proper evidence enough for such a bold universal claim, thus rendering the argument invalid. This can also be called an unrepresentative sample fallacy in more statistical terms, since its small size cannot properly represent the universality it claims. Conversely, the accidental fallacy attempts to invalidate given statements as exceptions to a given rule, much like its more extreme version, the no true Scotsman fallacy, or an appeal to purity, which attempts to invalidate a statement by contrasting it with a hypothetical perfect rule or standard. This is derived from the following. No Scotsman is a coward, but that fellow, who is a Scotsman, is a coward. Well, no true Scotsman is a coward. This attempts to establish an unquestionable standard which can only be exemplified by instances where they would fit all of the necessary criteria, excluding any other possible variations, and shifting its definition always to a purer version, an unscientific rhetorical device that tries hard not to dialogue with any counterexamples. This is also related to the moving the goalpost fallacy, very common in internet discourse, where, as the name suggests, the objective of the discussion is always altered to benefit one's argument in detriment of another, as if the goalposts were always changing around in a football match in order to invalidate the field goals of the opposing team, or making them more difficult to achieve. An example would be a discussion between person A and person B. A would say, all politicians are corrupt, where B could respond, but in this administration only a minor percentage have been convicted with corruption, and A would shift the goalpost to, well, then they probably already did something bad but weren't caught, where B could respond, but most of them have been in politics for several years now, surely they'd have been caught by now if they had done anything unlawful, to which A could shift again to something like, well, if they didn't do anything until now, they will probably do so later, and so on and so forth, never directly addressing B's arguments. Going back to the first informal fallacy we saw in the previous tutorial, the appeal to authority also has similar versions, as it isn't the only kind of fallacy that tries to appeal to something other than the argument itself. Some of them include appeals to emotions, as with the classic Simpsons quote, "Won't somebody please think of the children?" where Helen Lovejoy attempts to sidetrack discussions by getting an emotional response with this dramatic utterance to hypothetical children unrelated to the problem at hand. This happens every time someone attempts to shift focus away from the proper argument through either pity, fear, or flattery. Another example related to the appeal to emotions is the ad populum or mob appeal, which is when an argument is accepted or rejected only because the majority of people judge likewise. When someone is trying to defend the prohibition of abortion because the majority of people agree that it is wrong, or trying to prove the existence of God because most of the population thinks that God exists, this is a fallacious way of thinking. Nothing in the opinion of the mob makes something true or false by itself. In addition, the appeal or reduction to absurdity, reductio ad absurdum in Latin, happens when the most absurd instantiation of an argument would be used to try and invalidate it through ridicule, such as, if you can only accept fact-based evidence in peer-reviewed research journals, then you'd need to spend all your life reading scientific papers to even be able to get out of bed in the morning, a clear exaggeration with no actual bearing on any argument at hand. There's also the appeal to nature, which attempts to settle or invalidate an argument based on some natural quality involved, widely used in food fads, such as, this chemical is found in this kind of food and also in yoga mats. It is not natural to eat yoga mats, thus that kind of food is bad for you. Or conversely, processed foods don't occur naturally, thus we should not eat them. This is similar to Hume's law, as we've seen before, where an is statement mysteriously becomes an ought statement. However, the focus is on the rhetorical appeal to a hypothetical natural state, which would be superior and thus more desirable. One of the most common informal fallacies is the ad hominem, or to the person in Latin, with several variations given its widespread application. As its translation suggests, it focuses on the person rather than the argument they're making, similarly to the argument from authority we saw previously, however, attempting to turn the argument invalid given the subject at hand. A simple example would be, that person has arguments X and Y against the death penalty, but they're invalid since that person is condemned to the death penalty. Of course, someone in that situation might be biased against the death penalty, but this fact does not by itself invalidate any arguments they may have regarding the topic. A few variations to the ad hominem fallacy involve poisoning the well, or attempting to badmouth someone toward discrediting anything they say. The genetic fallacy, where the origin of the speaker is criticized in order to invalidate their arguments, and the circumstantial ad hominem, where indirect, incidental facts about the context of one's argumentation are used to try and invalidate their argument. A few other common informal fallacies would be the begging the question fallacy, or petitio principii in Latin, where a premise is circularly equal to the conclusion, such as with older people know better than younger ones because younger ones know less, which is the same as saying older people know better than younger ones because older people know better than younger ones. There is no argument there, just a statement attempting to refer to itself. Another one is the straw man fallacy, similar to the appeal to absurdity, where a weaker version of an argument is used in an attempt to disqualify it, such as when people say that vaccines don't protect you from diseases because you still can become infected by them, when the objective of vaccines is to diminish infection rates and severity, which they do. By focusing on a weak distortion of the real goal of vaccines, negationists sometimes attempt to discredit them instead of dealing with the actual science and evidence behind them. And of course, we'd also be committing this fallacy if we said that all negationists use a version of this to try and question science. This is only a brief example of a widespread use of this fallacy and not truly representative of their position, however fallacious it is. Hopefully, these examples will help you to enforce a more logical approach to discussions in the future, identifying mistakes or rhetorical attempts of fumbling and argumentation in your day-to-day professional or academic life. In the final part of this series, we'll take a look at some research, concepts, and philosophers currently active in the world of philosophy, so that you can proceed beyond the historical aspect toward becoming familiar with the field as it stands today.